Ready, sir.
Wonderful. Okay. Good morning and welcome. It is my joy and pleasure to welcome you this morning, or this evening, or this afternoon, depending on where you are, to this question and answer session with Vishal Agarwal, who delivered a talk titled "Perverting the Sacred: Hindu Deities" at Emory University. This talk was recorded on February 27th this year, and you have had access to that talk. Vishal, uh, given his wonderful knowledge about this so-called field of Indology and his intimate connection to and observation and close observation of both Indology as the field and Indologists as a tribe, has has shared some very interesting, informative, provocative stuff. And we hope that you have had the chance to listen to him, to watch him talk, especially about Paul Courtwright's book, um, which we have kind of, Vishal has done a kind of a reverse gaze. Uh, and so, without much ado, I want to once again introduce Vishal, uh, even though, as an engineer and who is, the, whose work, whose day-to-day work is something more technical. His work in this field of Indology, India studies, Hinduism, is such, and his knowledge so vast, that it's always a pleasure to listen to him, and of course to read his works. So today it is your turn to ask questions based on what you listen to about uh, the work Paul Courtwright did while he was at Emory University, and the nature of that kind of analysis of Hinduism, Hindu texts, and see what exactly this particular Western gaze has done to our own understanding of our own selves, of our own heritage, of our own cultural traditions, and see what we can do in terms of correcting uh, some of the kind of major errors, uh, deliberate kind of mischief that some scholars have made it their life work. Okay. Vishal, let me start off with the question, with a question. Uh, Paul Courtwright's book, published way back the last century, um, and the uh, controversy about that book that emerged in the early 2000s. Um, has there been any development that you see, you have seen in terms of people, scholars responding to your analysis and some of our writing on um, Paul Courtwright's book in the past, say, 15 years?
So
Um,
I
if I may quickly intervene, Vishal Bhai, before you start, I just quickly want to mention, and apologies for interjecting here, is that those who are participating can post your questions in Q&A section, and we will try to address them as much as possible. So please put your questions in there, and we are also live streaming and through YouTube and Facebook. And if you would have any questions, please on social media, if you can ask by hashtag Ask India Facts, then we'll try to take some of those questions as well. And my apologies, Vishalji, again, sorry to interrupt you. So now you can go ahead.
No worries. So, I think there is one major transformation that has happened in the last 15 years. And the major actors of this invasion and perversion of our heritage have now changed from these Western scholars to their followers or their students who are largely of Indian origin. It is somewhat like when the colonial powers initially came to India, their armed forces were largely European in origin, but eventually they hired and they trained and they manipulated a lot of people of Indian origin to fight their battles for them. So over the last 2 decades, a sufficient number of people of Indian origin have been brainwashed. And so now the Western scholars just of non-Indian origin, they just sit at the back and the major attacks on our heritage are happening through the left inspired circles, largely comprised of people here in the West who call themselves South Asians. One example that I'd like to give for that is the battle over a proper representation of India, ancient India, Hinduism, and other dharmic traditions in school textbooks here. When I got engaged in this activity in 2005 and 2006, the major leaders of who opposed our attempts were basically scholars of non-Indian origin. But fast forward 10 years from there, in 2016 and 17, the major players were actually ultra left wing scholars who were of Indian origin, like Kamala Vishweswaran. Uh, and they did get support from the Western scholars, but the Western scholars no longer had to take the lead. So this is what Rajiv Malhotra has called the sepoy mentality. The British eventually trained a lot of Indian sepoys who worked for the company or who worked for the Her Majesty or His Majesty to shoot at fellow Indians. So that's a very disturbing development. We can no longer allege that this perversion and invasion of our heritage is racist in nature. Rather, uh, I think it's an attack by what a lot of times in popular media you call coconuts, people who are brown only on the exterior, but they are totally colonized underneath. And I would add that they are also largely hollow inside. Thank you. So, as far as Western writings are concerned, I think they are very well aware that the gaze has been successfully turned on them. So, one doesn't find that extent of proliferation of demeaning tools like psychoanalysis or RNism while they're investigating or researching our cultures. But that's been taken on now by not specifically psychoanalysis, but there are other methodologies that have now been adopted by their followers who are primarily of Indian extraction.
Okay. Uh, that as you said is maybe the most from disturbing to challenging. How do we then deal with our own? What do we do in terms of the way we have become brainwashed, that our gaze upon ourselves is so jaundiced?
Yeah.
And whether you know you also see, for example, if hopefully that there is maybe therefore some new concern among emerging scholars to kind of challenge, especially I believe the left Marxist variety, but also, we do know uh, the kind of young Indian scholars, whether they call themselves philosophers or Indologists, uh, it has become their approach to studying India and Indian texts is so aggressively negative uh, that and whether therefore you have seen people emerge to kind of challenge, in terms of uh, not just their narratives, in terms of let's say specific misinformation, but maybe their methodological tools. And if that approach has been taken and effectively by any new scholars.
So I think the first thing that we a lot of times our defeat and our weakness is within our minds. When I first started engaging with the Indologists, I had a very traditional Indian outlook that these Indologists are scholars of our Shastras, and so they might have imbibed the ethical, moral, and spiritual values of the sacred literature that they have studied. But within a period of a few months, I discovered that when it comes to ethical and moral principles, they are actually below average. uh, it's like they pursue a study of our scriptures only because it's a profession for them. So our first step would be to shed off that reverence that we have in our minds for them. Don't put them on a high pedestal, and don't think that we cannot question them because they are so-called scholars. Everything that, for example, is written in Sanskrit is not sacred. Likewise, everything that's published in a journal is not necessarily scholarly. I have published in journals. I've been to graduate school for years, and we all know how these academic cartels work. The second thing is that bad ideas should be counteracted by good ideas relentlessly and with full self confidence. So, in this age of internet, we don't have those barriers that we had, for example, 25 years back when you had to publish in a peer reviewed journal, which was controlled by a small group of scholars. There are plenty of portals, and so our counter to their flawed scholarship has to be very relentless. Um, the second thing I would emphasize is that as a group of people who understand what's being done to our tradition, we need to ponder whether we are ourselves, whether we are creating an ivory tower at our own end. We often remark that these scholars are living in an ivory tower. They don't have any first-hand engagement with our culture. But we also need to look into our own situation. Are we just posting on the internet, or are we engaging our larger community? Because eventually, if we are engaging only 5% of us, then the 95% who are ignorant or who are misled are going to continue to produce this wrong literature. So I think it's very important for us to get engaged in our local institutions like the temples or different foundations that our community has in the United States or other countries. And through those foundations, we really need to make an effort to start schools to educate our children on what the right values, the right interpretations of our heritage are. Third, I think as a community, um, we have constructed thousands of temples, uh, and there's almost like a competition between different communities in the United States. My temple has 20 vigrahas, their temple has only 15. And eventually, all these temples will become museums if we restrict the scope of our temples to Karmakand. What the sponsors of the temples need to understand is that even the new set of immigrants from India are highly secularized, and they are highly left of the center in their thinking. And that's a result of 3 to 4 decades of brainwashing in India. Just an example is, that Rumila Thapar's textbook on ancient India was in currency for 35 years. We are talking about 2 generations here. So, so the focus has to shift on building and educating a community. We've built these beautiful temples, but we need to engage in areas that are of more relevance uh, to our community. Um, the fourth thing I would like to say is that we need to have a strategy on popularizing certain terms. As we've heard in the last few years, that words do matter. And some of us are even hesitant to use the word Hinduphobia or Hindumesia, antagonism towards Hindus or hatred towards Hindus. I think we really need to popularize these words and call out people who indulge in this hateful propaganda against us. Uh, a couple of weeks from now, there is a Hinduphobia conference at the University of Rutgers. And I would really urge all of those who are listening to Google it up. It's a free conference, and please spend that Friday in participating in that conference and find out for yourself how this hatred comes in many devices. On a heartening note, I do see that some sampradayas from our tradition, for example, the Swami Narayan, and we've always had the Chinmay mission for quite a while, they have really done excellent efforts in promoting our traditional knowledge systems in our community. I think if we don't want to start our own new institutions, here you have an example of institutions which are already running quite well. So instead of just focusing on the internet and reaching that same 5% community audience, we really need to get engaged on the ground, and expand our knowledge and wisdom, so that there's no short-term solution to this. It will have to be a very persistent and a very long-term effort. But if we really value and love our tradition, it's a battle worth fighting for.
Before we take questions from our viewers, I have one more kind of broad general question, and that is just the nature of Western academe. Um, this whole kind of social scientific approach to studying humanity, and the kind of methodological tools that have been used willy-nilly to study uh, these texts that were meant to do something else. When I read, for example, I'm not a scholar of any Indological field, but I do get those articles. When I do read them, the whole effort seems to be to kind of, as they say, anthropologize our lives, our texts, our traditions, our rituals, and so on. And so whether we can escape that web, or whether we can sunder that web so that we can offer ways of literally, and here again, just hearing myself speak, I understand how much the Western tradition has kind of has constrained us or shaped us in terms of the way we think about these things. So can you kind of briefly talk about that, and what can be done? Because as you said, our temples, beautifully built temples, people spend lots of money, they have all of these kinds of wonderful traditions and so on. But if not being taken over by the government like it has happened in India, or falling apart because there is no one to take care of them, or becoming some kind of study centers, museums, we don't know what can happen in a generation, because all it takes is a generation for things to fall apart. So can you kind of talk about your own kind of concern, especially in terms of the way we look at ourselves and the kinds of tools we use
So,
to look at ourselves?
and I think that's an aspect of your previous question that I probably didn't address in my answer. So, to elaborate to give an example to your question, should we use the word caste while describing our society, or should we use our traditional terms like varna, jati, and gotra and kul? And so that's when we start using words in a foreign language, a language that's foreign to our culture, each word in every language comes with a semantic range. What the word caste means doesn't is not the same as what the word varna and jati mean. So I think the first step, there can be two approaches to that. One is to get caught in that quagmire of analyzing these non-applicable or foreign methodologies that are imposed on our culture. Uh, I have personally steered away from that. And a part of the reason is, one is that I don't want to spend my whole life investigating methodologies which are very foreign. I want to understand my culture from our own cultural perspective. Uh, and even a lifetime is not sufficient for that. So it's purely a lack of time that I have personally, avoided. I have an awareness of what these tools are. In my own writings, I use these methodologies very rarely, and I try to make the tradition speak for itself. So a wonderful start in that direction would be to say, for example, read a recent book which is called Non-Translatables. It's authored by again Mr. Rajiv Malhotra and another a Swamiji, which gives wonderful definitions of terms. For example, God. Why is that word? Why is the word God not very appropriate to describe the Hindu concept of divinity? So I would recommend all of us to read that book and try to use those words from our tradition in our communications with each other. Let's not use the word God. We should always use the word Bhagwan, Ishwar, or Paramatma, or Parmeshwar, or something like that. And let's not, even when we are conversing with others. Like I taught a high school class in North Dakota yesterday, and I started my discussion by explaining to students why Hinduism is kind of an inaccurate term, although it's very widely known. I said, if you want to describe us more accurately, you should either use Sanatan Dharma, and then I explained to them why a dharma is different from an ism, or a self-referential term that we use is Sanatana Dharma, and then I explained to them why we call ourselves followers of Sanatan Dharma. And then I also explained to them how our concept of divinity is different from the Abrahamic concept of God. But the problem here is that for a lot of our educated community members, their frame of reference itself has shifted from the traditional to the Western or the colonized frame of reference. So they are more comfortable using the word God. uh, if somebody dies, you will see a lot of RIPs on the Facebook walls and in social media. Just a few days back, I was visiting a friend of mine, and he suddenly got a WhatsApp message informing him that one of his ex-classmates' father had died. He was just about to type rest in peace, and I said, no, 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 stop, stop. In our tradition, the soul does not rest. It moves on to its next abode, and maybe you should just end your WhatsApp by saying Om Shanti. And we just had like a brief 1 minute conversation, and he really saw, the value in not writing RIP. So, a change starts with influencing the people around us, and we all have to, we all have that light or lamp of wisdom, and we shouldn't hide it under a bucket or a bushel. And we really need to, whosoever we meet, whether it's our social engagements in parties, in programs, in functions, we should take each and every opportunity to not worry about what the others are going to think about us, and actually engage them and educate them on our right perspectives, on our own inner perspectives on how we view ourselves. If we don't do that, then uh, already we are being defined by others, we have been described by others, but it'll come to a point of no return. In our Sunday school, for example, when we do the first day training to our teachers and parents, we provide them with a list of words that they should not use, and then we give them equivalents. For example, we say, don't use the word sacrifice, use the word, yagya or yajna. We says, don't use the word God, use Bhagwan or Ishwar. So we provide them with a list of that, and every time in a class, a student uses the wrong word, the teacher prompts them, use this right word. Eventually, a range of meanings associated with that word maps out in the students' brains, and so they get a more authentic Hindu perspective of our tradition versus the colonial perspective that they're bombarded with all the time.
Yeah, I don't want to make this just a conversation or an interview of Vishal Agarwal by Ramesh, but just a kind of a follow-up question, because I think our modern lives, this kind of globalized world that we live in, uh, has kind of made us think about these matters of our transcendent selves, of of the mystic nature, facets of this cosmos, that we somehow are reducing it in this whole scientific, quote unquote, approach to understanding life. Though, of course, I think many scientists are themselves coming to that point, where when they discuss about consciousness and so on, and as Professor Subhash Kak has kept insisting that that is the last frontier for science, uh, which our traditions have really not just merely considered, but deeply probed. Is Have you seen that any kind of a kind of a change, or is this this uh, um, this whole approach of Indology and Indological studies and textual whatever stuff, the ship has become so big it is very difficult to steer that ship into the old waters, but also the new waters of these consciousness studies, so that indeed they can escape themselves from the kinds of knots that they have tied themselves up in and that they have wrapped us in.
So I think first of all, being a scientist myself, somebody who has a graduate degree, a post, graduate degree, a master's degree, who was in the PhD program and who's been engaged in science and engineering. I'd actually like to say that logical approach is anything but scientific. It is totally non-scientific. There is no, there is no importance given to primary evidence. It's just a layer of interpretation on another layer of interpretation, and opinions pass off as evidence. And so what I have found personally is, and that's where the recent works like the Nay Science by Vishward Lurie and Bakchi are very important. That what we think are scientific works in Indology are totally unscientific. It's almost like if you keep expressing skepticism to the extent of being cynical, you think that you are being scientific, but then they go on making all these conclusions, which have no basis and no grounding um, in actual evidence available. So I don't think that the Indologists really follow any scientific methodology. I mean, if anything, they need to be trained on what constitutes evidence, what is primary evidence, what is secondary evidence. A lot of times in these Indology discussion circles, we see them objecting to scientists and engineers finding faults with their works, and they say, "Well, you guys are not trained in liberal arts." But from a scientist's perspective, their whole methodology is so flawed. What they think is a devastating proof just turns out to be an opinion. It's and then after 50 years, the opinion becomes a fact, and after 100 years, it becomes the consensus or the scholarly conclusion. And that's how that whole edifice of Indology has been built with regard to a lot of the different theories that float around. So now, coming to the Indian way of analyzing things, actually, if you read the Darshan Shastras, our methodology is very, very rigorous. And so, one thing that I have done in my classes is, before we even talk about the nature of the divine in our tradition, I start with what we call the Pramana Mimamsa, in our tradition? What are the ways of knowing truth and getting knowledge? And then we have a discussion and debate in my class. And then we also analyze what are the 7 or 8 different ways in which what you see and what you hear can actually be false knowledge. So, and then what I do is after all these arguments have been tabulated, then I show the students all these terms from the Nyaya Shastra and other traditions that we already have. And I remember the first year when I taught the class where we debated does God exist or not, and then I listed all these terms from the Nyaya Shastra. My co-teacher was stunned, and he said, "I never thought that our tradition was so rigorous and scientific." So I would say actually that our tradition is very scientific, and maybe it's my bias being a scientist myself. I think we should adopt a true scientific methodology to study our culture. We have nothing to fear about it. It's that pseudoscience or an unscientific methodology that Indologists adopt, and that's what created that whole messy situation. In my presentation on Paul Courtwright's book, that was a classic example of garbage in, garbage out. If you distort, twist, or wrongly translate passages, and then you apply a wrong methodology, your conclusions are going to be fake and false. So I think the need of the hour is actually to train some Indologists on scientific methods so that their work is of a higher caliber than what it is right now.
So coming now to the specific, Emory University, Paul Courtwright and his book, which I think even the title of the book, Lord of Obstacles. And no, Ganesha is the remover of obstacles. So you start by saying he's a Lord of Obstacles. Um, can you kind of quickly summarize for our viewers, the kind of both the methodological flaws in it and maybe the kind of agenda, whatever the agenda is, if you can kind of highlight whether it's kind of a coming from a religious supremacist kind of an agenda, whether it is something else masked as an academic endeavor.
So I think his book came out of a PhD thesis that he wrote on the same topic. And for his PhD thesis, he got a few months scholarship and he went to Ahmednagar in Maharashtra in India, where he was also assisted by the local Christian missions within Maharashtra. Ahmednagar has a fairly substantial Christian population, thanks to the old, I don't know, Portuguese and British interventions. But um, it's that mindset of treating other cultures and other ethnicities as your equals. If you treat other ethnicities, other cultures, other nationalities as your equal, you would never think of them as just objects of study or as native informants. You would let their own heritage speak for itself. You wouldn't treat people of India or Hindus as museum objects whom you can analyze, but who have no voice of their own. That is what he has done in his book. He has imposed totally alien methodologies, for example, psychoanalysis, to distort a tradition. And to find data that is amenable to that analysis, the Puranic literature has about 500,000 shlokas, just the Mahapuranas and the Upapuranas itself. He has cherry picked verses, then he has distorted their translations. He has sometimes even invented passages which don't exist. So first of all, it's his lack of respect for people of India and the traditions we follow. He hasn't considered as us as his equals. Secondly, is that he had to write a PhD, and there's a publisher pressure in the United States. There are even acronyms called the LPU, least publishable unit. You need to get certain publications to get a job and then get tenured. And in that professional desire, he did not care what he was doing, whether it was ethical, whether it was right or not. He landed up totally distorting our tradition, and he got his book published, um, probably because of the patronage given to him by Wendy Doniger. And so there are, I would say, elements of um, a white supremacism. There's an element, I wouldn't call him a white supremacist as such, but people, who tend to look down upon other cultures wouldn't hesitate to portray those in a distorted and in a demeaning manner. And the second consideration is that the whole academic culture here in the United States, there's just so much fraud. I mean, even during the pandemic, we had a publication in a medical journal like Lancet, which turned out that the data was flawed. There's just so much pressure on academicians to publish and even twist and distort that it's leading to a lot of sad results. But the third is that this whole notion of free speech and freedom of academia, it's almost become like a fetish. um, it's There's a circling of wagons whenever anyone points out to flaws, to very fundamental flaws in the so-called scholarship. All the academicians gang up together. It's almost like the circling of the wagons by the wolves. And they start abusing you, they start branding you as Hindu fundamentalists and Hindutvavadis and Hindu nationalists. And so instead of addressing the core academic points, it just becomes a name. It becomes a name, a slinging match more often than not. And we've seen this kind of reaction from the so-called scholars repeatedly. It's actually a very unscholarly reaction. So I think we need to not worry about names being flung at us. If somebody calls you a Hindu nationalist, you call them a white supremacist. And that's all. Sometimes, if you are slapped on one cheek, it doesn't serve any purpose to turn your other cheek around. And I think that's what Hindus need to learn. There's no merit, there is no gain in trying to be the good boy or the decent man in the debate. You are not dealing with people who are rational, who are ethical, and who are fair. Let's stop considering these scholars as ethical, moral, fair, and just people. They are not. I've had engagements with them for over 2 decades, and they're, like I mentioned earlier, their ethical and moral values are below average compared to the people I encounter in my day-to-day life.
So, in terms of, the approach that Courtwright has taken, I mean, he's not a trained even psychoanalyst, but that one can psychoanalyze a deity um, is so far-fetched. But then this is all about what is fashionable and what is acceptable to an academic community. So yes, it is all metaphors. Everything's, pardon my allusion here. Everything is symbolizes the penis or the vagina, kind of an approach. Um, uh, and therefore, while there are kind of little snippets, because when I went to Emory University in, I think, 2004, with a group of concerned Hindus, I had read the book. And while there are snippets of information that, kind of interesting, about how Ganesha had also become, a kind of a symbol, and was being used by, political actors then, you know, freedom fighters, to kind of to you know uh, bring people together to challenge the British. And those were kinds of interesting information. But the more I kind of looked into how, you know, and how, almost, what is the word that I'm looking for here, brazenly, that uh, you know, he has used this bogus theory to literally diminish a deity that has stood for so many other symbols, if you want to simply go that route. um, have did you find anything at all in the book that was redeeming? I mean, and if for example, if he were to do it, I mean, and this is the other thing. Sorry, I'm tagging two questions here because it's become so much part of the ploy uh, by Indians, as you said yourself, Indian scholars, that anyone who challenges these kinds of works, these kinds of approaches to understanding Hindu practices, rituals, and so on, are simply labeled as Hindutva, Hindu nationalists, right-wing Hindus. Gosh, I'm tired of those things because I have been observing this, writing about these things, here and now for the last 30 years. So is there, I mean, could Paul Courtwright, or any other scholars in Indology look at, or have they looked at, for example, Muslim traditions or Christian traditions in India and unpacked or psychoanalyzed the way they have done Hindu traditions, Hindu gods and deities?
Well, starting from the end of your comment, obviously they wouldn't do that. His whole book is full of imaginary castrations and beheadings. And if he were to do that with some of these other traditions, there would be real castrations and beheadings. So, we see those things happening in France and other parts of the world everywhere. Um, Coming to your penultimate point, if asking me if there was any redeeming feature in his book, I really cannot recall anything except, India is a vast, it's a very deep, a very ancient civilization. And being from New Delhi, I have more awareness of cultures in and around Delhi. And I have also spent 5 years of my life in Pune. The only one thing I got from his book was some discussion on how the Marathi speaking area came into being right before the times of the Khiljis. And, so that was one interesting thing. And Paul Courtwright would probably hail it as one big accomplishment of his book. But when it comes to understanding and approaching Bhagwan Ganesh, there are beautiful books written by, even Gita Press has a Kalyan Visheshank on Bhagwan Ganesh. There is there is a book by John Grimes on Bhagwan Ganesh. Or if you are more historically inclined, there's a much superior book by Anita Rana Thapan. Or if you can read Marathi, there's a Ganesh Kosh. So there are tons of vastly superior books available, even though they might not necessarily have been published by the Oxford University Press, that are available to understand and to approach and to worship Bhagwan Ganesh. So books like these really have no redeeming feature. They don't really shed any light on our tradition. Instead, actually, they shed light on the author's brain. They're more a window into what the author is rather than what our tradition is. It's more like a self-confession, an autobiographical account description, than a description or an investigation exploration into our tradition. And I think your question had an initial part also, and I could you repeat that?
Yeah, it's basically, in terms of this whole kind of academic enterprise, and the kind of connection that uh, we are making in terms of marrying whatever modern politics, Indian
Oh,
complexity.
yeah, and I think even in his book there is a chapter in which he talks a little about Lokmanya Tilak, and then he jumps straight away he also jumps a little bit about into Hindu nationalism. But considering that the book was written, I don't know, in like 80s or 90s, the first edition, there wasn't much scope for him to write about that. But it's a very standard formula, reminds me of Hindi saying, Kahin ki eat, kahin ka roda, Bhanumati ne kunba joda. It's just no matter what the facts are, the conclusions are always going to be the same. Just 2 or 3 days back, for example, I wrote an internet article on the yoga where I was responding to a lady who said that with the rise of the current government, there is the rise of oppression of lower castes and patriarchy and upper caste hegemony. Well, it's all devoid of facts. Narendra Modi himself is a Ghanchi OBC, and the president of India is a Dalit. And, he's had the first finance minister, defense minister who's a lady, foreign minister who's a lady. So this kind of formulaic, cut and paste in a mindless manner is driven by mental blind spots and one's own prejudices. Um, and and I don't see why we should be intimidated by it. For someone like me who has, at this point of my life, I've spent most of my life here in the United States. If somebody is still relating me to Hindu nationalism in India, what that means is that he is not treating me as an equal American like he is. If I were from a European country, if I were an immigrant from a European country, would he have ever dared to associate with me with any European nationalism or any other movement like that? No, it's the color of my skin and my ethnicity that's making him encouraged to question. But as I mentioned earlier, the problem is that within our own community there are people who think that they are somewhat a class apart from the rest of us ordinary NRIs, and that they can analyze us from their pedestals. And I can only feel sorry for them. And it's reminds you of that book by Richard Crasta, Impressing the Whites. And so we really need to tell them. An example would be in 2004, I went to the office of Professor Martha Nussbaum, who was at that point of time writing a book, India, the Inner Conflict, or something like that. Um, and so after the interview was over, which eventually I did not permit her to use for a textbook, for a book, I asked her if somebody could take me to the Indian collection at the Regenstein Stacks at the University of Chicago. And so she called one of her graduate Indian students. And as the student was accompanying me to the library, I asked her what she was researching on. And she said she's researching on political theory applied to India. And I said, oh, wow. So you must be reading Kautilya's Arthashastra and other, texts. And she said, no. And I said, well, how then what's the value of your research? So that is what's happening here. Some of our students, they have the light right next to them, but they are overlooking it and they are seeking for the light somewhere else. And it's a whole re-education that we need to do in our own community of what our heritage says, the richness of our heritage. And it's a long drawn process. Like I said, we ourselves need to devote decades to understanding our culture, and then more importantly, we have to engage with our own community to educate people, so that we don't take these kind of abuses that you are a Hindu nationalist and all that stuff lying down. Even if somebody calls me a Hindu nationalist, I'm like, okay, I am. So what? I am not who you define me to be. I am what I think to be. And they don't control my bread and butter. They don't control my promotions. And I have my own career, and I don't give a damn what they call me.
Yeah, I think that's where I think some of the challenges are, because uh, it is a matter of bread and butter. Which side of the bread is buttered? So, and on which side of the bread are the fatwas? Uh, because as a social scientist, like whenever I use the term, I cringe uh, myself, because I know what happened in terms of my career, and I see what is being produced in my field, communication. I mean, there is a rash of articles over the past year about the pandemic, and I kind of humorously put this post on my Facebook page. It's specious theories in search of speculative data. You know, it is it's and I see this, because and it becomes people not, initially they have challenges doing that kind of work, but once they become familiar with and comfortable with and experienced in writing such stuff, they then embrace it as reality. They then get promoted, awarded, travel the world spreading their nonsense. And this is where I think this whole social scientific enterprise has taken us. And I think married with that is this kind of interesting modern 20th century, 21st century democracies, where you seek a separation between whatever God and country. um, and how that has, especially in India, made so many modern Indians basically lose touch with their own languages, with their own traditions, with their own texts. And why blame them? It has happened to us in my in my generation. When I look at my family, my siblings, my cousins, this kind of deracinated life that we have lived, somehow thinking that that is the only way to go, uh, which has now, as you pointed out, it becomes therefore easy tools available that Martha Nussbaum's student could use to crank out yet another thesis or a dissertation, and then go teach it to earn a living. It is not an honest living, for heaven's sakes. I, you know, I wake up in the middle of the night saying, what have I taught the last 30 years? So even though some of my students say, good, Dr. Rao, made me think about this kind of stuff. But you know what? A wise, mother, father, grandmother could have told my students what I tell them. Uh,
Yeah. So I think to that point, I'd like to point out that in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 16, Bhagwan Krishna gives a list of 26 divine treasures of virtues that we must possess. And the very first thing that he lists there is abhayam, fearlessness. It's literally jo dar gaya wo mar gaya. And one should not be fearful of ninda stuti from the public. We should always choose what is right. We come from a civilization where India still has the national motto Satyameva Jayate. Eventually, truth will triumph. We need to be fearless and we need to have shraddha in our heritage. And related to what you've said, there's a comment here in the Q&A box from a participant. And she says, to quote her, here in India, particularly in Mumbai, there is a certain sense of alienation from dharma in academics. Any conversation about dharma among my own friends is seen as an upper caste hangover. Is there a ground where we can think of a common ground where we can all reach each other without sarcasm, hatred, and constant report of past hurt? So I think first of all, we should avoid from our end sarcasm and hateful talk, and pointing to past hurt. But that's only one part. We also need ourselves to be immune to sarcasm and hateful insults by others. And we should take it to our heart that we are not here in a popularity contest. There might not be a middle ground. If both of you are already to the extreme left, then the middle ground will also be on the extreme left. So you have to be not just somebody who's seeking a compromise, but you have to assume the role of a leader who wants to shape how others want should be viewing our culture, and be inspirational to others so that they change their opinions. If you really believe that their opinions are wrong, then what is there to compromise it? We have to stick to our opinions, and we have to constantly keep pushing our opinions on others, whether whatever occasion. Of course, doesn't mean that you have to be obnoxious and overbearing. It requires certain tact and skill also. But in my own case, like Dr. Ramesh Rao also mentioned, we hold and subscribe to certain views, and a lot of times our own family members and friends think that we are extremists. And I don't get intimidated. We don't get intimidated by that. Sometimes these kind of comments come from people who are very dear and near to us. And so it's that persistent education of the uninformed that we have to continue with. And I have personally seen a lot of people change their opinions and minds. In this pandemic, there's also been a pandemic of these webinars. And I personally know two people who were ultra left wing just 2 years back. And then after watching some of these videos, they are just shocked how much ignorant they were. And they have totally, changed their opinions. So we have a big task ahead of us. Just because there's opposition doesn't mean that we get intimidated. I think it's a big opportunity in front of us. Um, there's another question in the Q&A box. Do you want me to take that?
Yes, please.
So this question is, are there objective, rigorous ethical review processes for humanities research, like ones that exist in STEM? Who monitors them? And what role do the participants have in them? Is this an avenue for exploration? So I think I'll let Dr. Rao and Dr. Avatans Kumar and others to respond to the humanities part. But when it comes to STEM, there does exist a so-called process, but the process works well only if the referees who are shepherding that process are competent and fair enough. You can always follow the process and check mark all the boxes with a very poor result. It's like a lot of the interviews that you might undertake to apply to a role. A lot of times the candidate is already selected, but they do have a process. They follow the steps, they check mark every box, and then it's the same candidate they had already selected before the interview process who emerges as the best candidate for the role. So we've frequently seen, even in scientific journals, that papers are retracted despite having gone through a double blinded peer review process. And scientific data is easier to falsify. It tends to have less subjectivity, in my opinion, than a lot of the data in humanities and other social science studies fields. So I don't know, Dr. Rao, would you like to comment on how the process works in your field?
Let me ask Avatans ji to kind of, because trained as a linguist anthropologist, he has seen quite a bit of the kind of turbulence in those fields. And then I will pitch in with my own experience and what I consider as what we produce.
Um, Quickly, first of all, clarification: I am not a PhD. I was in the PhD program, but did not submit my dissertation, so I'm not a doctor. But to the larger point, we see a lot of things that you have talked about in terms of objectivity and critical, analytical, and scientific. Those things are don't work very well in the humanities field. Um, Recently, I wrote an article for Swaraj where we looked at I looked at one of the articles by Professor Vishwad Luri and Joydeep Bakchi. He had reviewed one of the books. I think it's about anti-Semitism, and it had a lot of reference in linguistics, and so I took it from there, and I did further research, and I found out that, and I know some of the Indologists were not happy with that paper and characterization, but there is a lot of assumptions that were made in linguistics, and especially in comparative and historical linguistics, that were not true. Just the assumptions. Um, and in the end, all the exercise that we look at, so Indo-Europeanism, Proto-Indo-European, they were all a very racist exercise, you know. Um, so I don't know what else I can add beyond that at this time, Professor Rao.
Yeah, I mean, the simple fact is this: that in the what we call the hard sciences or engineering, you can actually test things in the lab. Okay, the number of variables that you choose, can be specific, and you can experiment on them. You can test them. You can also do, or in math kind of proof, and whoever does it will or should get the same answer.
Right.
That is the nature of quote unquote science. But what happens in the humanities? I mean, the humanities, they don't do these experiments. It's basically, you know, opinions, of course, considered opinions. Um, but in the social sciences, we have this kind of an interesting combination. We are neither the humanities nor the sciences, but we somehow claim to bring the rigor of the sciences to look at the human conditions. Whether it's in political field, or the economics field, or the communication field. But it's very difficult, in terms of being able to control the variables, and we can't put people in the lab. I mean, people have done it, like Milgram did, in terms of his study about authoritarianism. But even there, some of those studies are so deeply flawed in terms of the way they are set up, that it's only whatever findings are, commonsensical findings mostly.
Yeah.
Okay, and therefore, especially, as we step into this quote unquote field of religion, Western, mostly Abrahamic, and then the quote unquote Indian faith traditions, what is it that you can really test? What can you bring to bear in terms of your analytical lenses that can shed better light than what Vishal has mentioned, in terms of the Bhagavad Gita, the kind of, or Indian philosophical systems, the darshanas that offer those kinds of wonderful tools for, what can be considered evidence, how much evidence, and what can they tell. These are things that, here again, coming back to the kind of Courtright and Emory situation, that this person basically made his life teaching nonsense. And Emory is a richly endowed private university that pays its professors handsomely. And that book, God knows, I think after the controversy, it sold more copies. And Professor Courtright might still be getting royalty on that, on that tract of his. Uh, so it becomes, this is, I mean, America has been known as the place for snake oil salesmen. If you can concoct little things, and then have the right kinds of, marketing and sales tools, you can sell anything. And in so many ways, what the social scientists have done and continue to do, as well as, of course, now anyone from cultural studies and gender studies and God knows whatever else, it is a riot out there, people claiming all kinds of things. And these becomes, celebrities overnight. You, as soon as you get published an opinion piece published in the New York Times, then next day you will find that there are 20 invitations from universities across the country for you to, you know, talk as an expert. For example, this whole book by Isabel Wilkerson on caste. She has made her millions, and she will get a dozen awards or more. She has been invited by God knows how many universities based on specious junk, theorizing about race and caste in ways that are kind of, again, selling these kinds of concoctions in political climates where people will buy those things, not because they are the truth, but because it helps their political agendas to gain power, to maintain power, to act on those powers. Those are very important considerations that we need to be kind of also, looking at when we see what are the kinds of agendas, either hidden or accidental, in terms of the study of the other. And here in our case, about Hindus and Hinduism. And that, I think, is the kind of danger. And I, as Vishal has mentioned, and as I see, there are so many people who say, oh, this is rigorous work, and oh, it kind of provided me insight. No, it didn't provide insight. You just had not read books before. You had not looked at your own traditions before. And that's why something, suddenly something that which is new, you think it as informative or insightful simply because of your past ignorance about your own traditions. And that, I think, is something that I know, again, Vishal, because he teaches students, and that's amazing how much good work that he is doing and is written for students, and that which we adults should be reading, because we have lost touch with our own past and our own customs.
I think Balu, S.N. Balagangadhar addresses some of this issue when he talks about the history as being scientific, and he gives one of the examples in one of his talks is about the 2016 U.S. elections, and he says that there are so many books and papers and things have been written about what brought about the change, the blue collar disenchantment and this and that. And, after 20 years from now, that will become a solid fact. But given the circumstances, if you call it science, if those are the facts that we are discussing for 2016, if we apply the same circumstances, we will have the same result again, will we? That's not guaranteed. So that's not the science, that part. Can I take a question from Facebook for Vishalji?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I have a question that says, can we look at this whole project of diminishing Hindu traditions as an exercise in epistemicide?
Maybe the person should elaborate this question, more, if he can.
Okay, I'll see if that person types more details.
There is a comment. Meanwhile, there's a comment on our discussion. So the commentator says that the word Hinduphobia does not have much respectability right now. It's used whenever it's used, the reaction is one of derision, whereas the term Islamophobia is very well accepted. And that's quite correct. I have personally seen Hindus even denying that there is any Hindu phobia, but the same people will rally against Islamophobia. It's a classic case of Stockholm syndrome. From my own example, 2 years back, I did a presentation on Vasant Panchami, and in that I gave the example of a teenager in our tradition, Hakikat Rai Puri, who was beheaded for refusing to convert to Islam. And in his memory, in Lahore, the Basant Panchami festival was celebrated by the Hindus with great gusto. So after I did the presentation, the school administrator came and told me that some parents objected that you brought in that example. And I said, why? I mean, why should I shy away? Are they telling me that I should shy away from describing my own tradition? My forefathers came from Lahore. It's a part of my heritage. Why should I deny my heritage? And secondly, the students should know the truth. And the third thing I told her was that, I am one of the founders of the school that you are an administrator of right now. So I don't see myself as a passive deliverer of things that people want. The school was started, to promote education, and so we see as thought modifiers, as people who should mold other people's thinkings, not just passively provide what they are asking for. So I think that's what we need to look at ourselves. If 95 plus percent of our population is ignorant, we really need to assume the role of thought leaders, and accordingly we need to be unapologetic, we need to be fearless, gutsy, and these are the qualities that are needed to eventually shift the public opinion within our own society.
Has there been further elaboration from the questioner about epistemicide?
No, not yet.
Simple, as we all know, epistemology is about the nature of knowledge. And so basically, this, I think the questioner is asking, is this, this whole Western enterprise or modern enterprise, let's not just call it Western because we have adopted it, and people all over the world have adopted it, is basically therefore, destroying our own understanding of the nature of knowledge.
So I
Having never,
wanted the person to use our own term. I mean, I did know that epistemology means praman mimamsa in our tradition. So I wanted that person to use our own terminology rather than borrow something which is not very applicable. Um, I would just say that, epistemology as a discipline is very underdeveloped in other traditional philosophies around the world. Whereas in India, you you always start your study of any darshana first with undertaking the praman mimamsa. So we are talking at, in along parallel paths. There is no meeting point. uh, you know, if we are reversing the gaze, we need to apply our own epistemology to analyze other cultures and traditions rather than have people who don't have a sophisticated epistemology to analyze us. That's what I want to harp upon. We think upon a lot of Indological works as works of scholarship, but they really aren't. Their methodology is extremely shoddy. Opinions become facts in a matter of few generations. It's just layer upon of one
I think we lost
looks like we
Vishal ji.
lost Vishal.
I think we lost him.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, just wait a few seconds. He will probably
something wrong?
rejoin. Yeah.
Okay. As we wait for him to get back, and if Avatanji, if you can kind of see if you can connect back channel and he's
Yes.
back on. Uh, I think just to kind of see if I can uh, kind of elaborate on what Vishal was talking about. Uh, that this whole idea that somehow Hinduism is a religion, similar to the kind of faith traditions of the monopolists uh, or the supremacists. My God is the only God, my truth is the only truth approach to prophetism, to the book, and so on. Hindu traditions are not. Hinduism is deeply philosophically, darshanically grounded. Darshana is sight, and it is not mere seeing in terms of some kind of a visual thing, but it is seeing as reason and as knowledge, insight. Um, that is what the darshanas provide, and even a simple, ordinary beginning student of the darshanas will see how profound the inquiry systems that were put in place, the rigor that they brought to kind of ensure that you know we look at the human condition and the human ability to reason, as Roberto Calasso mentions that in the Rig Veda itself there is something like 146 mentions of the mind. That is the nature of Hindu tradition, and unfortunately, here again, we are now living in times, and because again of Indian history, of the kind of attacks on the land, on the people over a period of more than 1,000 years, uh, you know we have ignored so much of our own. Okay, I believe Vishal is coming
He,
back.
yes, he's
Okay,
coming back. Yes.
okay. Sorry, we lost you, Vishal. So I was trying to kind of, uh, hold the ground here uh, poorly. So now I'm going to give it, hand the baton back to you.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't realize my computer was not connected to a power source. It died. So now I've connected it. Um, but like I said, that the 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 so-called tools and techniques, they are often a fashion of the times. Even psychoanalysis, I don't think is being used quite as much as it used to be 20 or 30 years back. It's like the bell bottoms. When I was a kid, my grandmother, and I was 4 feet tall, my grandmother would ask the tailor to have 1 foot, bell bottom shaped trousers. But today, when we look back, we all laugh. And so that's the case with a lot of these so-called um, tools and techniques and epistemologies that are used. They're the fashion of the day. And the answer is, should we always get bogged down responding to these temporary um, fashions, or should we march along our own in a path that's charted out by our own traditions? I think it's, first of all, it's necessary. It is necessary to keep engaging with something which is more temporal, which is more temporary, uh, but not at the cost of getting distracted from our overall purpose. The more permanent and eternal value that our tradition has to offer to humanity.
Yeah, this is something that uh, here again, uh, for people who think that modern studies, uh, in terms of reading our texts, analyzing our texts, understanding our practices, dissecting our practices, reading our minds, uh, putting us into corners, uh, gazing at us as if we are objects. Uh, these are dangerous enterprises, uh, and again, uh, dangerous for us. What is dangerous really for the quote unquote these scholars is to look at those people who respond dangerously. So they don't go there to really look at and study and put into corners those that threaten them.
Right.
So they are left alone. It is not that We have an organization of the Hindu Council of 64, Hindu nations in the world. We have 64 countries of the, organization of the Islamic Council. There is power, there is money, and there is, real global kinds of dynamics that play into some of these, these um, projects of studying us. And finally, I think, in terms of the whole modern Western academic approach to studying everything under the sun, which then again, modern universities are vested interests. Every department seeks to grow, and it is a limited pie, and they all wish to cut slices of it. Okay, there are certain limited source of funding. People seek to kind of present, put their best foot forward, present their best images to continue to earn a living. Nothing more, nothing less. And unfortunately, this pursuit of living poorly, I'm not saying this is living dangerously, this is living poorly, because we are doing a disservice to ourselves, and then doing a disservice to our students and to the larger public by offering bilge. So this is this, but that's a kind of a larger issue. We have about 5 to 10 minutes left, um, and I want to kind of circle back to Paul Courtwright and to Emory University. Um, so Vishal, in terms of kind of your thoughts, in final thoughts on the nature of that particular project, and if Courtwright himself later wrote anything about his own efforts to study Hindus and Hinduism and Ganesha. Did he, did he write anything more? Was there a kind of a quote unquote change of heart, or was there any kind of change in the trajectory of his own work?
I haven't really seen anything on Ganesha come from his pen. Maybe there was an article or two by him or by other Indologists who, again, predictably took this controversy as another means to tar us or tarnish us as dangerous Hindu fundamentalists who were baby killers in Godhra and demolishers of Babri temple and all that. And then, so you'll find a lot of those articles in, academia.edu, or if you Google. But like we mentioned, like I mentioned, that we are who we believe ourselves to be, and so just like we see dime a dozen of these useless articles, we can also write dime a dozen useless articles to show what these people are. In my presentation in February, I did talk a little bit about a brief conversation that I had with Paul Courtwright over email on his book. And also mentioned to his reaction to the controversy in a scholarly list. And a very perceptive comment that he made was that he had written this book for an American audience. Had he known that there would be an Indian audience that would read his book, he would have written it differently. And my comment was, well, that reflects very, it reflects intellectual dishonesty. You don't distort the message to play to the gallery. Just because the American society in those times perceived Indians as the erotic other, did that mean that Courtwright had to play along and demean a culture of, in 80s, the population of India was still about 700 million people. So I think that confession, to my mind, it just further brings out the dishonesty that with which that book was written.
Okay.
And that happens when you don't treat the other cultures, other ethnicities, and other nationalities as equal to your own. So it is a form of supremacism and racism.
um, Avatans and Nishant, any questions from you? Otherwise, we can kind of get to our
There
wrap-up
is
moment.
an elaboration on the question that was asked in on Facebook. Bhai, you want to take that, or I can take it?
Sure, go
Yes.
ahead.
So the question was originally for the epistemicide was asked by Arjun Chaudhary, and he says, further elaborates, can we talk about these readings in cultural history as arthapatti? Then I will not use the word epistemicide again. Arthapatti is a form of iconoclasm, much like what Shankara faced during his career from the Bauthas. And then he further goes on to say, since Vishalji insisted on using the word pramana, and I thank him for that, can we look at this whole discourse as an intentional exercise in arthapatti?
Well, it depends on whether you want to have your discussion in a framework of Vad or Jalp or Vitanda. How do you classify the other person's so-called scholarship? In my opinion, Paul Courtwright's book is not an example of Vad. And so accordingly, filtering through Jalp and Vitanda, the nature of that Arthapati, also changes. So when you are confronted with an opponent who is not at all interested in Vad, who has ulterior agendas, then as the Nyaya Shastra says, that sometimes you really need to build a thorn of hedges along a flowering plant to protect it. So there, accordingly, our response to these kind of uh, very unethical perversions of our cultural heritage have to be responded to accordingly. Um, yeah, I mean, there is a view that we should always take the higher ground. And I have a mixed opinion on that. We should try to keep the standards as high, keep our conversation as much to the level of VAD as possible, but sometimes it's inevitable that you do stoop down to the other two levels.
I mean, if the opponent's level is way in the below the ground, then what are you going to do with the high level? Maintaining a high level. So yeah,
So
that's
in
good.
my own recent article on yoga, for example, I tried and I wrote to Professor Ameshra on that I've tried to keep a high ground, and I've focused on educating the fence sitters. I don't take these discussions and these debates as a means to convert the opponent to my viewpoint. Majority of the population, um, they are fence sitters, and they just don't know. And so one has to not only counter the opponent but also bring forth our viewpoint very forcefully, so that these fence sitters get the correct understanding of the issues involved.
I quickly have just a quick curiosity that when you guys went to make the presentation at the Emory University in that room, I was wondering if you could take us as a cinematographer in that room and quickly describe just what was happening and what was the reaction in short, if it's possible.
Yeah, we were if I recall, and again, this is the interesting thing about memories. We were, I think, about 6 or 8 of us, and from Emory, they had the dean of their School of Arts and Humanities or Arts and Sciences, and their provost. Uh, One of us, I believe, it was Professor Narayanan Komarat, who did a PowerPoint presentation about the kinds of problems with Courtwright's book. And then we had and also a presentation about the kinds of concerns the Hindu community has and had. Um, and I I'm trying to think you know think back and see if we kind of demanded that they reconsider what Courtwright was teaching, or whether the book was being used as a prescribed textbook. I think those were the two concerns that we raised. And we really did not get any response from these two, kind of stone faced men, white, top administrators of Emory University. We even brought to their notice how Emory University had punished a faculty member who had, I think, not, in any deliberately negative fashion, but had used this old English kind of uh, 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 adage. Here again, a caution. These days, we have to be careful um, about blacks. And that person had been reprimanded, and it was just using a particular adage that was in common use in the US, okay, and not in a negative way, but to kind of say, this is, kind of a metaphorically speaking. Interestingly, Emory University to this day, today, has the same issue because another professor of theirs, teaching law, used the N word in his class, not to, disparage a group, but how the word has been used in some legal context. That person is going through all kinds of challenges now, and he's been asked, there's pressure to get him out of Emory, and so on. And we said, look, if you respond to one group this way, why are you responding to us this way? There was no response. And it was kind of difficult for us because we were basically talking to these, stone-faced, uh, you know, uh, two men who refused to tell us anything. So that if at all, kind of taking you into that. And I had flown, I believe, from Missouri, taking all kinds of, and it was kind of, and we had prepared. I still have a binder, that we had prepared, that we had given to Emory University, and they had it for a whole week to look through, and they had nothing to tell us. So with that, maybe it is time for us to wrap up. Okay. Some quick thoughts by Vishal, and then maybe I am going to kind of wrap this session up with a few words. And of course, if Avatans or Nishant has something to say too, and then, really, I'm happy that Avatans did say, please ask questions, but we don't seem to have gotten much, but it's been wonderful to have Vishal. And so, Vishal, any final thoughts?
Well, I would just like to say that nobody gets their rights on a platter, and nobody is a better advocate for our culture and civilization than we are ourselves. So the onus is on us to project the correct interpretation and understanding of our own culture and society. um, we cannot blame others if they are perpetually distorting it. What have we done from our side to counter those distortions and promote the right view? So I would really urge everyone who is watching or who will watch this video to devote themselves to understanding who we are, and be very persistent, very fearless in standing up and defending our heritage. Thank you.
Avathans, Nishant?
Not much. I just would like to thank you, thank Vishalji for this wonderful presentation. And, we have multiple Emories going on right now in present, so we have to be mindful. And like Vishalji said, counter and fight because we represent ourselves the best we can. Nobody else can. So
And please
thank
do
you.
register for that Hindu Phobia conference at the Rutgers University. I would really commend the Hindu Student Association at that college who really
Yes.
stuck their neck out against the avalanche of falsehoods and hate mongering by Audrey Trushke. So let's support those students and participate in that conference in a few weeks from now.
And if Professor Ramesh Rao, if you have a announcement for the next in the series, we can also make that.
Uh, no, not, I don't want to jump the gun here, but what I want to say is we will have more such presentations and interviews and question answer sessions uh, because there is quite a bit of ground for us to cover. A lot of stuff that we need to kind of understand. And so we are going to make our announcements. So please keep a lookout for those. And once again, I would really like to thank Vishal for all of the good work that he has done, he is doing, and we hope he will continue to work on those issues. And I believe I will be inviting him for another session with us here at India Facts. And I would like to thank Avathans, Nishant, people in India who have set up uh, uh, the technology for us to have this conversation, and for all of the people who attended uh, this morning's sessions. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Namaste.
you very much. Thank you all. Thank you, Vishal.